Statistically, humanity should not be here. For most of our existence as a species, we lived in small, fragile populations, scattered across landscapes that wanted us dead. Climate instability repeatedly drove human numbers toward the edge of collapse. Entire regions became uninhabitable within a single generation. Food systems that had sustained communities for centuries could vanish without warning, leaving behind only silence and frozen ground. There were moments in prehistory when the total human population may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals, not thousands of communities. Thousands of people. The entire species balanced on a threshold so narrow that a single sustained drought, a single catastrophic winter, a single failed migration season could have ended everything. And during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets buried nearly a third of the Earth's land surface and average global temperatures ran 8 to 10 degrees colder than today, the greatest threat to human survival was not exposure, not predators, not territorial conflict. It was starvation. Because staying warm only delays death, finding energy is what prevents it. And this forced early humans to confront the hardest survival question our species had ever faced. How do you stay alive when the world stops feeding you? The answer to that question may explain not only how humans survived the Ice Age, it may explain why civilization exists at all. The Ice Age was not a single frozen wilderness stretching uniformly across the planet. It was a volatile, unstable, constantly shifting system of colliding ecological pressures that changed faster than most species could respond to. Temperatures fluctuated dramatically across decades and centuries. Grasslands that had supported enormous herds for thousands of years could thin and collapse within a few human lifetimes. Animal migration routes shifted in response to vegetation patterns that no longer existed. Entire ecological networks, built across millennia of stable relationships between predator and prey, could unravel as the climate lurched between cold pulses and brief warming intervals. For most species, this kind of instability leads to one outcome: extinction, because evolution favors specialization, and specialization is a bet on stability. Predators become extraordinarily efficient inside stable systems. Their bodies, their behaviors, their hunting strategies are all optimized for a world that remains predictable. But when that predictability disappears, efficiency becomes fragility. The more optimized a species is for one environment, the more vulnerable it becomes when that environment changes. Humans survived because we did something genuinely unusual in the history of life on Earth. We did not become the best hunters. We did not become the most powerful predators. We became the best adapters. Instead of depending on a single food source, humans began deliberately spreading survival risk across many different strategies simultaneously. Large animals when available, small animals when necessary, fish from rivers that resisted freezing, plants and roots during brief seasonal windows, stored food that extended yesterday's success into tomorrow's uncertainty. This was not instinct. Instinct is fixed. This was strategy, and strategy is where survival begins to look like engineering. Large Ice Age animals represented something early humans understood at a fundamental level, even without the language to describe it. They were concentrated energy. A single adult mammoth could weigh 6 tons and carry enough caloric value to sustain a group of 20 people for weeks. Bison herds that stretched across the steppe provided not just protein but the dense animal fat that a human body requires to survive prolonged cold. Reindeer offered seasonal predictability, following ancient migration corridors across the same routes generation after generation. But pursuing these animals was not simply dangerous in the way that modern people imagine danger. It was dangerous in a way that threatened the entire group's survival simultaneously. A wounded mammoth could kill multiple hunters in a single encounter. A failed hunt series during late autumn left communities facing winter with inadequate fat reserves. Injured hunters unable to travel became dependent members in a system that had no margin for dependence. Ice Age survival sometimes meant living inside uncertainty, measured not in seasons, but in days. This is where humans began doing something that no other predator in the Pleistocene ecosystem had managed to develop. They began systematically reducing uncertainty before it arrived. They studied migration patterns across multiple years and encoded that knowledge in memory and in the stories they told around fires. They planned seasonal movements to position themselves at natural choke points where herds would pass. They developed coordinated group hunting strategies that used landscape features, cliff edges, river crossings, narrow valleys, to dramatically increase success rates against animals far larger and more dangerous than any individual human could confront. They were not simply hunting animals. They were managing probability. And probability management is the foundation of every engineering discipline that has ever existed. But the true breakthrough in Ice Age survival did not happen during the hunt. It happened after it. Because survival is not ultimately determined by what you can kill. It is determined by what you can use. And early humans, facing the reality of a world where successful hunts were rare and the energy cost of each attempt was enormous, developed what can only be described as a philosophy of total resource extraction. Muscle tissue provided protein for immediate consumption and repair. Organs, including liver, kidney, heart, and lung, provided dense concentrations of micronutrients that lean muscle meat alone could never supply. Fat, whether from beneath the skin, from around the organs, or rendered from bone, provided the critical caloric density that determines whether a body survives extreme cold. Bone marrow, accessible only through deliberate tool use, offered some of the most calorie-dense food available in the Ice Age environment. Brain tissue provided essential fatty acids and lipids that supported neurological function. Even the tendons and connective tissue that most predators discarded served as raw material for the tools and bindings that made future survival more likely. Stone tools did not simply make humans better hunters. They unlocked calories that no other carnivore in the ecosystem could access. A lion abandons a carcass when the easily consumed portions are gone. Early humans with purpose-made stone tools could return to a frozen carcass abandoned by every other predator and continue extracting survival energy that had been invisible to everything else in the landscape. In a collapsing ecosystem where every calorie represents a margin between survival and death, the ability to extract more from less is not a minor advantage. It is the difference between a species that persists and a species that disappears. But the challenge of Ice Age nutrition was never simply about finding enough food. It was about finding the right balance of food, because the human body has metabolic requirements that can turn abundance into catastrophe if that abundance arrives in the wrong form. Rabbit starvation, which researchers now call protein toxicity, describes what happens when the human body is forced to metabolize excessive lean protein without sufficient fat or carbohydrate to accompany it. The liver and kidneys become overwhelmed processing nitrogen waste. Energy drops. Cognitive function deteriorates. Hunger intensifies even as consumption increases. People have died with full stomachs because the food they were eating could not actually sustain them. Arctic explorers in the 19th and 20th centuries encountered this phenomenon with fatal consequences, eating abundant lean meat and dying of what appeared to be starvation anyway. Ice Age humans were solving a nutritional engineering problem that most species never encounter, because most species do not have the cognitive capacity to recognize the difference between eating and surviving. Early humans were not simply asking whether something qualified as food. They were developing, across generations of observation and accumulated knowledge, an understanding of what constituted survivable energy. Fat became survival currency in a way that was understood practically long before it was understood biochemically. Marrow extraction became a systematic behavior rather than an opportunistic one. The preference for organ meats over lean muscle was not accidental or purely taste-based. It reflected a deep, culturally transmitted understanding of what the body actually requires to function under sustained cold stress. This was biological problem-solving conducted across generations, encoded in culture, and passed forward as survival knowledge that compounded with every generation that learned it. Plants completed the survival equation in ways that the archaeological record has historically underrepresented, partly because plant materials decay and leave no stone record, and partly because early research focused on the dramatic megafauna hunts that seemed to define Ice Age culture. But even in environments covered by permafrost and glacial ice, the plant world offered hidden caloric layers that experienced foragers knew precisely how to find and use. Underground storage organs, the roots, tubers, rhizomes, and bulbs that plants use to survive winter by storing their own energy reserves below the frost line, remained accessible to humans with digging tools throughout much of the year. Seeds, particularly grass seeds, from the vast steppe grasslands that dominated Eurasia during the glacial maximum, could be collected in quantity during brief autumn windows and stored in ways that preserved their nutritional value across months of winter scarcity. Berries and other soft fruits offered brief but intense seasonal windows of sugar and micronutrients that experienced foragers timed their movements to exploit. But plant use required something more demanding and more dangerous than hunting skill. It required encyclopedic knowledge, because the plant world contains as many threats as opportunities. Roots that look identical to edible species can carry alkaloids that cause organ failure within hours. Fungi that appear safe under certain conditions become toxic under others. A single error in plant identification, passed uncorrected through a community's knowledge base, could kill multiple people before the mistake was understood and corrected. This transformed knowledge itself into survival technology of the highest order. Not tools, not weapons, not fire, but the accumulated and carefully preserved memory of what was safe, what was dangerous, when things were available, and how they needed to be processed before consumption. This was the first human infrastructure, built entirely inside minds, transmitted entirely through language and demonstration, and leaving no physical trace that any archaeological expedition has ever recovered. Water systems became some of humanity's most reliable and strategically important food zones during the Ice Age, for reasons that become clear when you consider the fundamental difference between aquatic and terrestrial food sources. Rivers fed by glacial melt often resisted complete freezing, particularly where gradient kept water moving quickly enough to prevent ice from forming solid barriers. These rivers created ecological corridors of relative stability within landscapes that were otherwise hostile and unpredictable. Fish, particularly salmonids following ancient anadromous migration patterns, arrived in predictable numbers at predictable times in predictable locations. This predictability was not marginal, it was transformative. A group of Ice Age humans who had positioned themselves along a reliable salmon run could harvest and process more protein in a few weeks than months of large game hunting might yield. With a fraction of the physical danger and none of the catastrophic failure risk that accompanied mammoth hunting. Coastal regions, particularly those along the Atlantic margins of Europe and the Pacific coastlines of Asia and eventually the Americas, offered even greater dietary stability. Shellfish beds required no hunting skill and almost no risk of injury. Marine mammals provided fat concentrations that rivaled any terrestrial source. Tidal zones and kelp forests supported ecological communities of extraordinary diversity and density that could sustain human populations at levels impossible to achieve on pure terrestrial foraging alone. The deep pattern here runs across the entire span of human history, from the Pleistocene to the present. Reducing volatility is what every advanced survival system attempts to accomplish. From prehistoric fishing weirs to modern refrigerated supply chains, the fundamental logic is identical. Stability creates the conditions for survival. Volatility destroys them. Ice Age humans, living along reliable water systems, were learning exactly the same lesson that modern agricultural civilization depends on, just 40,000 years earlier than the textbooks usually suggest. But perhaps the single most consequential invisible invention of the Ice Age was something that seems almost embarrassingly simple when stated plainly: food storage. Because survival is not ultimately determined by how well you did today, it is determined by how prepared you are for tomorrow's uncertainty. The paraglacial environments of the Ice Age offered something that equatorial and temperate environments could never provide to the same degree: natural refrigeration at ambient temperature for months at a time. Meat cached in permafrost or packed into snow-covered storage pits could remain consumable across timescales that completely transformed the survival calculus of a hunting community. Fat rendered from animal tissue and stored in containers made from stomach, bladder, or intestine could remain nutritionally valuable for months. Bones preserved by freezing could be cracked and processed for marrow long after the hunt that produced them. This capacity to store survival across time may represent one of the first genuinely revolutionary cognitive shifts in human history. A group that can eat today's surplus tomorrow is a fundamentally different kind of organism than one that must find new food every single day. Storage converts luck into stability. Storage converts a single exceptional hunt into weeks of reduced risk. Storage converts the terrifying volatility of the Ice Age food environment into something approaching a managed system. Long before the first seeds were deliberately planted in the Fertile Crescent, long before the first animals were selectively bred for human use, and long before the first grain silos were built in the early cities of Mesopotamia, Ice Age humans had already discovered the most important operational rule that civilization would ever learn. Food security is survival security. Control over your food supply across time is the foundation of everything else that follows. None of this could have been accomplished alone, and this may be the most important and most underappreciated truth about Ice Age human survival. The cognitive demands, the physical requirements, the knowledge base, the tool production, the logistical coordination, and the intergenerational transmission of accumulated understanding that made Ice Age survival possible were all beyond the capacity of any individual or any small family unit operating in isolation. Ice Age survival required cooperation at a scale and sophistication that is genuinely rare in the animal kingdom. Experienced hunters tracked herd movements and carried mental maps of migration corridors that spanned hundreds of kilometers. Skilled toolmakers produced the specialized stone and bone implements that made efficient butchering, hide processing, and food storage possible. Foragers with deep plant knowledge diversified the community's diet during periods when large game was unavailable. Elders preserved the long-cycle knowledge of climate patterns, resource locations, and ecological changes that unfolded across timescales longer than any individual lifetime. Parents and community members ensured that children absorbed the survival knowledge base before they were old enough to need it independently. This created something that evolution very rarely produces and almost never sustains: a species where knowledge accumulates rather than resetting with each generation. Biologists and anthropologists call this cumulative culture, and it may be the single most powerful evolutionary adaptation that Homo sapiens ever developed. Because physical strength does not accumulate across generations, speed does not accumulate, individual intelligence does not accumulate, but knowledge compounds. Every generation inherits everything the previous generation learned, adds its own discoveries, and passes the combined archive forward. This is the mechanism by which a physically unremarkable primate became the most consequential species in the 4 billion-year history of life on this planet. This is where the Ice Age food story transforms into something larger than a survival narrative. It becomes the story of human cognitive expansion, because the relationship between food and intelligence during the Pleistocene was not one-directional. It was a reinforcing cycle with consequences that extended across hundreds of thousands of years. The human brain is one of the most metabolically expensive structures in the known biological world. It represents roughly 2% of total body mass, but consumes approximately 20% of total caloric intake at rest. Supporting a brain of this size and complexity requires reliable access to energy-dense food, particularly fat and protein, delivered consistently enough that the brain can maintain its extraordinary operational demands without interruption. Cognitive impairment begins within hours of caloric deprivation. Planning, coordination, memory retrieval, and social cognition, the precise capacities that made Ice Age survival possible, are among the first functions to degrade under nutritional stress. This means that better food systems directly and immediately supported better cognitive function. Groups with more reliable, more diverse, and more nutritionally complete diets could maintain the cognitive performance necessary to develop better tools, better strategies, better social coordination, and better knowledge transmission systems. Better cognitive performance then produced better food systems in return, better hunting logistics, more efficient extraction technology, more sophisticated storage methods, more reliable knowledge networks, energy-built intelligence, and intelligence-built energy systems. And that loop compounded across dozens of millennia into the cognitive and cultural gap between Homo sapiens and every other species that shared the Pleistocene world with us. Neanderthals were not the simple brutes that early 20th century science imagined them to be. They were powerful, anatomically robust, cognitively capable survivors who had lived successfully in European and Western Asian environments for roughly 300,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in significant numbers. They used fire, buried their dead, created ornaments, and manufactured sophisticated stone tools. By any reasonable standard, they were remarkable. But increasing archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals differed in ways that became decisive in the volatile, rapidly changing environments of the late Pleistocene. Sapiens' exchange networks appear to have been wider, moving raw materials and likely information across distances that Neanderthal groups rarely matched. Sapiens' diets appear to have been more diverse, incorporating aquatic resources, small game, and plant foods at higher rates than the Neanderthal record typically shows. Sapiens' social structures appear to have supported larger and more fluid group sizes, enabling the kind of coordinated, large-scale cooperation that transforms individual intelligence into collective problem-solving capacity. None of these differences were dramatic in stable conditions, but volatile systems do not reward stability. They reward flexibility. In an environment where the food base could collapse and rebuild across timescales shorter than a human lifetime, the group with wider networks, more diverse strategies, and greater behavioral flexibility could absorb shocks that eliminated groups dependent on narrower, more specialized approaches. This may be one of the quietest and most profound truths in the entire story of human evolution. We did not outmuscle the Ice Age. We did not out-endure it or out-hunt it. We out-adapted it. An adaptation at this scale and this speed is not a biological phenomenon. It is a cultural one. So how did Ice Age humans find food in a frozen world? They did not simply find it. They built systems to make finding it predictable. They turned hunting into applied logistics, using accumulated knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal timing to compress probability in their favor. They turned foraging into environmental science, building mental maps of plant communities and water sources across enormous territories. They turned food storage into deliberate infrastructure, using natural cold to extend today's success into tomorrow's security. They turned cooperation into a knowledge network that allowed information to accumulate and compound across generations, with a fidelity no other species has ever matched. Long before the first city was built, humans had already understood that survival is a systems problem, not an individual one. That controlling your food supply across time is the most fundamental form of power that exists. That knowledge, preserved and transmitted with care, outlasts any physical tool ever made. We became dominant not because we were the strongest, but because we were the first species to engineer our own survival probability, rather than simply accepting whatever the environment provided. The first human infrastructure was not cities, it was survival. And civilization may trace directly back to the moment a human being looked at tomorrow's uncertainty and decided, deliberately, to do something about it today. If you want to keep exploring how prehistoric humans solved the hardest problems life can present, subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. Because the first human technologies were not built to make life more comfortable. They were built to make sure we would still be here. And history may have begun not with kings or monuments, but with the moment a human being learned to make sure there would still be food tomorrow.